Good morning, everyone. First of all, let me welcome you all on behalf of Vocal Europe. We are delighted to have you here today. I am Inès Gentil. I am a researcher at Vocal Europe, and I am honored to moderate this event today, which will be recorded and that we will disseminate on our social media channels and via email afterwards. Before to start, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Henri Malos, who is the president of the Jean Monnet Association, former president of the European Economic and Social Committee, and a chairman at Vocal Europe. Thank you.
Yes, hello. So I'm very pleased to open that webinar. I hope we have some interesting thought. I would just say it will be probably a first attempt to have a meeting, to have a debate on a very complicated and very dramatic situation. As we know, when we planned that event 1 month ago, we were hoping that we'll be soon to the end, but unfortunately we are not. Unfortunately, the news from Ukraine and from the neighboring country around are not good at all. So, but anyway, I think it's the task of us make some analysts who are far from the battlefield to try to imagine what could be the future, and to be not too pessimistic, but to have bring some light in the tunnel, specifically for the Ukrainian population, which is very highly suffering these days, and to see what we could expect for a better future and for an end of that tragedy, which I call a tragedy. So the purpose of that webinar, you understand, is not to analyze the reasons why and so on. This has been done several times, and we could do that later on. But now is to see what are the perspectives, to find a way out, and what could be the perspective and the situation for European Union after that disaster. So I think I'm very thankful to the Vocal Europe team, and to Mr. Izik, and to you, Inès, for your commitment to try to organize this debate in this very heavy and difficult situation. Thank you very much, and I give you back the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Malos. So today we will discuss the key challenges and the long-term consequences of the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war. In particular, the conflict is raising many concerns, both at the regional level regarding the consequences it might have on the European security order and status quo, but also at the global level, as Russia is threatening the very principles of sovereignty and democracy. In today's webinar, we intend to evaluate the intermediary role of the EU and other countries such as Turkey, India, Israel in this conflict from a diplomatic point of view, and to discuss the possible outcomes to end this conflict. More precisely, the question raises again on how the EU should engage to mitigate this conflict, as many believe Brussels should have responded to the wake-up call provoked by Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and to the permanent dispute in the bloc's leaders and diplomats seem more united in considering the war not only as a post-imperialist aggression against a sovereign state, but also as a massive threat to the European security structure. As we already know, a main challenge which arises from this conflict is pertaining to the creation and consolidation of a common European defense policy and culture, but important questions remain unanswered in this regard that we will try to address with our speakers today. We will also discuss the potential adhesion to Ukraine to the EU and or to NATO, which is a particular divisive issue both in Ukraine and in Europe. In this context, this webinar will not only try to make sense of the indirect consequences of the war, such as the ongoing massive flow of refugees on the European continent, as well as Europe's heavy dependence on Russian oil and gas and the resulting community split over the energy price shock, but it will also deal with the overarching question of How will this conflict in Ukraine potentially end? And what will be the long-term consequences for both Ukraine, Russia, and the EU? I will now quickly introduce today's panel, and we will open the debate for our distinguished speakers. So our first speaker today, Ambassador Pierre Vimont, is a French diplomat who served as the Executive Secretary General of the European External Action Service. Mr. Vimont is now a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe. During his 40 years as a diplomat working for the French Foreign Service, he served as ambassador to the United States, ambassador and permanent representative of France to the EU, and chief of staff to three former French foreign ministers, Dominique de Villepin, Michel Barnier, and Philippe Douste-Blazy. He was also appointed in 2019 by President Emmanuel Macron as special envoy for the architecture of security and trust with Russia. Thank you very much for being with us today, Ambassador. Our second speaker today, Mr. Oleg Voloshin, good morning. Thank you for being with us. He's a Ukrainian journalist, former government official under Ukrainian Prime Ministers Mykola Azarov and Viktor Yanukovych. He was the former Ukrainian presidential attaché to Russia, and he had been the director of the information department of the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine. In 2019, he was elected to Verkhovna Rada, namely the Ukrainian parliament, as a representative of the opposition platform For Life Party. Thank you very much for being with us. Our third speaker today is Ms. Yasmin Gilgal, who is the Vice Chair for Foreign Relations and Security at the Turkish Democracy and Progress Party, DIVA. She completed her MA in International Relations at Yale University and her PhD in Political Science at the University of Chicago. She also teaches and conducts research specialized on international relations theory, regional power politics, and Turkish foreign policy. Thank you for being with us today, Ms. Gilgal. And our last guest today who will join us later during the webinar because of some parliamentary duties is Mr. Sviatoslav Jurash, who is the youngest ever member of parliament of the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, for the Servant of the People Party. He was an active participant in the Maidan Revolution in 2014 and founded the Euromaidan International Center. He joined Zelensky's presidential campaign in 2019 to work on international outreach, civil society outreach, and the campaign efforts in Western Ukraine. Moreover, Mr. Jurash had been a local producer for Fox News as well as for the BBC in Ukraine. With such a diverse and experienced panel, I am sure the following discussion will be thrilling and insightful. As you already know, each of you will initially have the floor for 7 minutes and then 5 more minutes during the second part of our webinar. So we will start the debate now. Ambassador Vimont, my first question for you is, following the re-election of President Macron 4 days ago, what can we expect for the development of the strategic compass in the upcoming years? Or is this defense model only about strengthening NATO's capabilities? Moreover, would you say that this conflict will also trigger some positive consequences in terms of European unity and ability to conduct for a common foreign policy? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ines, and thank you for inviting me. I hope you can hear me, no problem. I will be short because I think this is what you've asked us to do, but you've raised many questions and a very impressive menu for our discussion. But let me try to stick to the two questions you asked me. The first one, the future of the strategic compass after President Macron's re-election. I think we need to be aware that Europe has responded to that crisis, that Ukrainian war that has been imposed upon Ukraine by Russia. Europe has responded with a very swift and robust reaction to that, with economic, financial sanctions, with the delivery of military equipment, with humanitarian assistance also, and that is important, and strong political support to Ukraine's position everywhere in international fora, and among other things in the UN Security Council and in the General Assembly of the UN. So that has been important. Where do we go now with strategic compass? We have to be aware, I think, that in this ongoing conflict, what is at stake at the end of the day is the collective defense of the European continent. And collective defense is the responsibility of NATO mostly. And we have seen the impressive presence of the United States, the role it is playing, the resources it is mobilizing, financial, industrial, military capabilities, so on and so forth. These resources it is mobilizing for that purpose. And I think it is important that at the moment, this is what we're focusing on. And of course, in that context, European defense looks very much as complementary, but not as at the center of what we're doing now for the moment. And we have to understand that, you know, the future of the European security and defense policy will also depend upon the kind of resources, financial, industrial, military resources that the member states will be ready to put together. And at this stage, these resources are being mobilized essentially for the NATO purpose and for our support to Ukraine. So this balance, for the time being, I would say, is more in favor of NATO cooperation and transatlantic cooperation than strictly focusing on Europe. And we have to be aware of that and to accept that. It only means that European defense will take long time, take longer, and that we need to be patient, as we already knew when we launched the strategic compass. On the role Europe can play on the international scene to support Ukraine and our point of view, here I would like to underline one point that I think is important to keep in mind, is that what we're witnessing more and more on the world stage is this narrative of the West against the rest. And we have to be very careful about this. For many of our partners in the outside world, out of the Brussels bubble, this is a Western a war. It is a war between European nations and Russia, and also the United States, of course. It's between the transatlantic allies and Russia. And they don't want to get involved into this. You see many countries sitting on the fence, even if as a sort of first move, they have voted in favor of our resolution in the UN Security Council or in the General Assembly. They're not too eager to go along now. They don't want to go along with sanctions against Russia. And more than anything else, you can hear from many of them this feeling that they buy in the Russian narrative. They don't see the aggressive nature of what has happened with regard to Ukraine. They don't see the tragedy, or even if they see the tragedy that Henri Malot, was talking about, they don't want to be involved into this. And therefore, we have to change to some extent our attitude, not trying at all costs to convince those partners that we are right and they are wrong, not try to put too much emotion on this, but to try to look for, rather than having pressure on them, to look for solutions, to try to convince them of a narrative on which we can all agree, it seems to me, that what is happening in Ukraine is a violation of the mere principles of the UN Charter, of everything that is related to international law, to the rule of law, even to humanitarian international law, and that we should all be supporting the efforts of the UN Secretary General to try to bring a ceasefire, to bring humanitarian relief to Ukraine, and to try to get out of this horrendous tragedy that we're witnessing at the moment in Ukraine. We have to reach out to our partners in the outside world. Otherwise, the gap will broaden, and it will be more and more difficult to bring them back on board. And the third point I wanted to make, Ines, which is the one related to what you were saying about the EU, the European security order or security architecture, as it is sometimes mentioned. This war has one consequence, it seems to me, a very obvious one, is that the former European security order, dating back to Helsinki and the Paris Charter of 1990, all this has gone. It has evaporated. It has disappeared. And once we have managed to get peace back again in Ukraine, once we have been able to help Ukraine to reconstruct, because they're going to be a huge reconstructing effort for Ukraine, then we will need to look at the long term. And one way or another, we would have to look back again at what I would call the Russian issue, the Russian problem that we're facing now for many years. We missed something after the end of the Cold War in not being able to get Russia on board with all of us and to build a European security order where we could trust each other and when there was enough confidence between all of us. So we have to go back to the negotiating table to reinvent a new European security order. It will be about principles that we could all agreed on many years ago, but which seem to be now under duress. We will need to look back again at all those agreements on arms control. We will need to look at new security guarantees for everyone, starting with Ukraine. And we will have to build a new European order that brings back stability to our continent. Now, of course, in order to do that, we have to start with a ceasefire, and we have to start with a peace settlement. And that is the most important for the time being. Nobody knows how long this conflict is going to drag on. And I don't think it is a good thing for this conflict to drag on. I think the sooner we can stop it, the better. But that I will leave it maybe for later for our discussion. And I will stop there, Ines, because I've been talking already quite too long. Thank you.
Extremely interesting. I have now a question for Mr. Voloshin. In an interview for the Time magazine in February this year, you said that we need to find a diplomatic compromise between Russia and the West. Would you say that Ukraine's neutrality and renouncement to join either NATO or the EU would be a necessary condition to achieve this diplomatic compromise between the two sides? And would you encourage Ukraine's adhesion to the EU as promoted by President Zelensky? Thank you.
Thank you, dear moderators. Thank you, dear participants. I'm very happy to be with you today. These extremely dramatic and really horrendous days for every Ukrainian. I will try to present my very sincere views on this extremely important issue that will define for sure the future of not only Ukraine, but of the whole world. I will present my views that might differ from what you might have heard from many of you, my countrymen, for the last 2 months, because I still continue to represent exactly as in the above-mentioned interview in the beginning of February, as I did together with, and I'm very grateful for this, to Andriy Malos in Paris on February 11th, when we tried to, through the mechanism of parliamentary dimension of Normandy format, to bring together the parliamentarians from Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France to find a compromise how to implement already that Minsk agreement. So I continue to represent the doves rather than hawks. My colleague, who I greatly respect, Mr. Yurash, who is a member of the Foreign Policy Committee from the ruling party, he will definitely present the more regular line represented by Ukrainian government. But I represent another view that is not easy to express nowadays being in Kyiv. That's why, unfortunately, I'm not complaining, just letting you know the fact I have to stay in Belgrade for already 2 months. I'm in Serbia now. Because my party is persecuted and because for our position. So it's strange, but those who tried to prevent the war are now accused of bringing the war. bringing in the war. So just because we stood and continue to stand for the dialogue with Moscow. First and foremost, what Mr. Wimon said, at the end, I'm really grateful for his input, and I know his personal input for years into trying to solve the Donbass conflict. And we shouldn't underestimate what France had done to try to have this problem solved. The diagnosis he made is correct regarding the lack of trust between Moscow and the West after the Cold War. Unfortunately, I can't agree with his suggested way forward. I believe that page is already overturned. So it's impossible to come back to the Paris Charter for New Europe. This whole idea of Russia becoming a part of Western society, of Western community, liberal order, is already dead. I mean, Russia did try, but we need to be very, very honest with ourselves. It was neglected. It was defied. It even tried to join NATO. So I hardly believe any such attempt would take place anytime soon in the future. And it doesn't depend on Mr. Putin personally. It's the mood of the majority of Russian society. I attentively follow what is written by respected foreign policy experts in Moscow, like Fyodor Lukyanov and others, those who, in the first days of this conflict, in the first days of this war, were extremely shocked with the very fact of military operation, military methods used to pursue political goals. But nowadays, they all agree that for Russia, it cannot be a zero-sum game. So, I mean, it cannot just lose. If it's pushed against the corner, as I'm now sitting here against the corner in this lovely Belgrade cafe, you understand. I don't want to threaten anyone, but you understand the arsenal of military instruments that Russia possesses. So first and foremost, what needs to be understood is the current conflict is not something that started on the 24th of February. If you talk to many of my colleagues, they would say you were in war with Russia for 8 years, and that's true. To some extent, to large extent, that's true. There has been a conflict in Donbass that, unfortunately, we all failed to have resolved. There were troubles with Russian position, but there were definitely troubles with Ukrainian position. There was lack of will of Mr. Zelensky to have Minsk agreements implemented. Although he was elected with a peace ticket, he wasn't elected to fight war against Russia. He wasn't elected because people wanted to win war over Russia. He was elected because people wanted to live in peace with Russia. That should be remembered. And what is very discouraging and disappointing for me is a switch of position of European Union these days. They are now talking about victory. They are not talking about peace settlement. Very strange, frankly, if it's given that, but for France, all our other EU members don't have nuclear weapons. So victory over nuclear power, let's be realistic. It means a nuclear war. We should be very frank with this. I stress again, this conflict is a failure of diplomacy on all sides. And definitely aggression has no justification. But as analytics, as politicians, as those who try to seek a standing solution and sustainable was the most important solution, we need to understand the roots of this crisis. Not just say it's Moscow, it's bad. Let's change Putin for someone else, or let's I don't know what, move the capital of Russia from Moscow to other city, and it will be different. It won't. It's not just a small rock state. It's not North Korea. It's a great power that has its interests, that fights for its interests, and if needed, it will fight for its interests with all possible means at its disposal. I don't think that anyone in Europe, and especially in Ukraine, that already suffers, that already struggles every day, and it's not. There's a lot of talking about fighting and the suffering of Ukrainians, but we should understand every new day of this conflict increases the suffering. I am a person who believes that any peace solution is a victory because it will stop suffering of Ukrainians. That was what we need to understand. Because it's very easy to sit somewhere like our president does, some in a safe bunker and say, I won't compromise, say, on NATO or on something else, unless we get some guarantees, and let's discuss these guarantees with Poland, Turkey, and others, and let's discuss it for 2 months, for 3 months. I don't understand his position. He should be in the shoes of those sitting in the front line. He should be in the shoes of those being in the towns and cities in the front line. Yes, we can say that's Russia that is guilty. Okay, it is guilty, definitely. But if Russia doesn't care for Ukrainians, we Ukrainians should care for our citizens. So it means, for me personally, any compromise, even if it comes to some very painful concessions, is still better than continuation of war. And what I strongly decry and denounce is an attempt on the part of some of our European partners to encourage Ukrainian government to continue fighting instead of encouraging Ukrainian and Russian government through sanctions, through other instruments to get to peace solution. And definitely when we start to now talking about not just getting back to where conflict started on the 24th of February, but already about getting Crimea back with Russian retributions, etc., it puts us on a very dangerous path that this conflict will only get escalated together with the sufferings of Ukrainians and, let's be frank, and forward-looking, possibly with the sufferings of Europeans, because there is a very high risk that we shouldn't try to overlook it. There is a very high risk that some, if maybe not, but some of NATO countries like Poland or Romania can be directly dragged into this conflict. And again, I know that Ambassador Vimon and Rima Los and others are people who follow Russian politics and understand Russian politics and follow what is discussed there. Again, for them now, it's as principled fight as for Ukrainians.
I'm sorry, we will need to move to the next question.
Yes, surely. And yes, and so it's just like so I don't want to take more of your time because there are other speakers to step in, but I believe that it's very important for us to understand that at this moment, what Malos, what Vocal Europe does is extremely important. We need more and more discussions talking about the end of the conflict, not only about the possible victory over Russia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Voloshin. We will also hear Mr. Jurash when you join us, as I believe that you two have two diverging opinions on the topic. Now, Ms. Gilgal, I have a question for you. As Turkey's relations are warming up with Kiev, while they seem to be weakening with Moscow following the closure of the Bosphorus in particular, will Turkey succeed to maintain its balancing policy between the two sides as advocated by President Erdogan? And more generally, would you say that neutral countries such as Turkey, Israel, India, among others, have a key role to play in that conflict? Thank you.
Thank you. First,
we cannot hear you, Ms. Gilgal.
Okay, I think it's okay now. First, I would like to begin with saying that we strongly condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we do see it as Russia's attack on Ukraine's territorial integrity and political sovereignty, as well as regional peace and stability and order, which Turkey is also part of this regional order. Turkish government, since the start of the invasion, has actually pursued a much more balanced position by maintaining a relationship with both the Russian and the Ukrainian side. It has been a constructive dialogue, actually. And I think Turkey's diplomatic efforts at bringing the two sides together to negotiate is valuable and constructive, since the priority at this point should be achieving a ceasefire and ending the war as soon as possible. And Turkey's actually, this constructive role has been looked upon favorably by the European countries, the United Nations as well. Of course, the question is whether Turkey can sustain this balanced position as the war goes on. I think the main question here is whether the war escalates and how long the war will last. Because if the war escalates, it would be hard for Turkey to sustain this position, because most probably there will be more pressures on Turkey to switch its more or less active neutral position. And I think it's crucial here to recognize that if Russia is more pushed to the corner, the possibilities of escalation and the risks that could be associated with escalation could also increase. One thing to note also, Turkey has not joined the sanctions regime, which more pressures could be put upon Turkey to join if the war continues or escalates. So at this point, I think it's important for Turkey to maintain this constructive position, which creates a dialogue between both sides. But one thing to keep in mind also, the fact that Turkey is a NATO member country also gives Turkey the power to be an important mediator in this war. So Turkey actually takes its strength from the fact that it's part of NATO. If Turkey, for example, were not part of NATO, Turkey is actually the role it could have played in this conflict would have actually been different. So I do think there's a need for Turkey's significant role, not only in achieving a ceasefire, applying the rules of the Montreux Convention, but also for humanitarian assistance, as well as the evacuation of civilians from the Ukrainian cities. So as the war continues, the humanitarian role Turkey could play, I think, is also very important at this point.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gilgal. This was very interesting. Mr. Jurash has not joined us yet, so we will. I will now open a second round of questions, and we will then have some time left for general Q&A session at the end. You are now free to react to what has been said by others also. Ambassador Vimon, I come back to you. Would you say that the EU did enough since 2013-2014 to mitigate the conflict and ensure the implementation of the Minsk agreement? I'm obviously referring here to the Maidan Revolution, the start of the Donbass conflict, and Crimea annexation. And according to you, what should be the priority of the EU now that Russia has invaded Ukraine? The sanctions, weapons delivery to Ukraine, or urging for a ceasefire? Thank you.
Many questions here, but let me first react to what Mr. Voloshin was saying, because I understand many of his arguments, but I think we should avoid going for the blame game and go for some very straightforward evidence. To me, is that whatever reasons you may have, there is no excuse for starting a war, and more than anything else, the kind of war we're witnessing at the moment, where civilian population is being attacked, where cities are being flattened, and Mr. Voloshin knows better than me, because he is Ukrainian, how the suffering of the Ukrainian people is huge. So we all agree on the necessity to stop this conflict as quickly as possible. But I still think there is no excuse for starting a war like that one. And the one who started the war was Russia. And, you know, as a French diplomat, and I totally agree with Mr. Voloshin, this is a diplomatic failure, no doubt about it. But as a French diplomat, I've seen how much energy and efforts the German diplomats, the French diplomat have put in this Minsk efforts, in this Normandy format to try to implement the Minsk agreements. And it never worked, because on both sides, and I can only repeat that, on both sides, there was mistrust, and it was very difficult to create the kind of dialogue that would have allowed to go forward. And maybe one of the problems, and let's be honest about this, is that the Minsk agreement was a very short-term agreement, namely a ceasefire, and trying to come out of a 6 months conflict that was there. There was maybe a lack of a long-term vision about where we wanted to go from there. And that may be the reason why, if we go back to the negotiating table with a ceasefire and a negotiation on a peace settlement, we will need to look also at the long-term vision. And this is where I have a second problem with what was said by Mr. Voloshin, is that the Russian vision of the future of Ukraine, just listening to what President Putin said in his now very famous speech of the 21st of February on television for all to see, is something that is difficult to accept, because it is the negation of the Ukrainian nation as such. And I think this is not acceptable. It's the violation of territorial integrity. It's the violation of the Ukrainian sovereignty and independence. And I think this is part not only of the European order, but of the international order. This is at the basis of the UN Charter, and I think everybody should respect it. And there is no excuse for just thinking that because your point of view was not taken into account, then you go for war. I'm terribly sorry, but this I cannot accept. Yet, as you were saying, and I think we should all pay tribute to Turkey for its efforts, and I totally agree with Yasmin that Turkey is doing the best it can to try to push forward a mediation. I think we should all work on this, of course. But, you know, in order to convince Russia to go back to the negotiating table, you need to show strength at the same time. Even diplomats know that. If you don't negotiate from a position of strength, you go nowhere. And we have seen it with this horrendous war as it has happened. So, yes, we have to still work for a negotiation and for a ceasefire, but we have to show strength at the same time. And I think that is very important. I stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Voloshin.
If I may, I'm very grateful for very appreciated comments by Ambassador Vimon. I agree. I want to put my record straight. Definitely, there is no, and it cannot be no justification to at least we tend to have no. It used to be in the history, but nowadays, because Clausewitz told yes, that's always just politics with other methods. But we hopefully not using the Clausewitz nowadays. But there should be no justification to military methods. That's why, again, with me sitting just like 300 meters away from the famous Ministry of Defense building of former Yugoslavia, that was bombed by NATO, actually, and it just happened just 20 plus something years ago, 23 exactly years ago, with no UN decision, with Russia strongly opposing, and most importantly, people in Belgrade strongly opposing this being bombed by NATO, with NATO ruining all the bridges across Danube, okay, under noble pretext, but Russia also believes it has a noble pretext, actually, after all. So we shouldn't say that what Russia is doing is something absolutely unique. That's why we need to be absolutely honest with ourselves. And again, it's not about checking who is wrong. Definitely Moscow was wrong. And first and foremost, it let down everyone who was sympathetic towards Russia inside Ukraine. That's why I can be here, because I receive almost on a daily basis life threats to me, to members of my family. And effectively, I was let down by Moscow with its aggression that I had to flee for a while, hopefully, my country. But I try to be realistic with regard to search for the solutions. And the solution cannot be just like realistically. We cannot expect not only Mr. Putin, but it's about nowadays almost half of Russian population. Let's be frank. There are strong attempts, unfortunately, in the West to make all Russians guilty, to expel Russian musicians from operas, etc., etc. So we cannot expect all of Russian people, majority of them, to come up and say, yes, we were wrong, we are sorry, let's pay back to Ukrainians. It won't just happen. And as longer we don't accept, and however displeasant this truth might be, the longer will be the sufferings of Ukrainians. My call is very simple. We know who is wrong, but it's like hurricane. There is a hurricane. We can come out and say there is a hurricane. We don't like it, but we need to find a way to settle down the hurricane. So not just saying hurricane is bad. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Voloshin. I had a question for you, actually. I wanted to ask you if the division of the country into a Western Ukraine and an Eastern Ukraine, including the Donbass region, Mariupol, Crimea, and the other territories, be a plausible option, according to you?
Surely, as a Ukrainian politician and citizen of Ukraine, I strongly reject any division of my country. But as a former diplomat, as a diplomat and a PhD in and I defended thesis on Russian foreign policy, like some 15 years ago. I assume that the longer war continues, there is a greater probability that Ukraine, as we knew, will never reemerge. That's my absolutely analytic. That's a point of view. I strongly reject this development. But I have to admit that it is possible.
Thank you, Mr. Voloshin. Now, Ms. Gilgal, you are also free to react to what has been said. Would you say that this conflict allows Turkey to position itself as a regional decision maker? And if yes, to what extent and what kind of relations could Turkey envision vis-à-vis the EU, Russia, and Ukraine in the future?
I think this conflict has also demonstrated, as Europe is rethinking its security policy and how it can reestablish regional order and stability, I think it demonstrates Turkey's significant role for playing its significant role for the regional stability and order. But and also the importance of collective security. I think one thing this crisis has shown also the importance of NATO and collective security. And I think this is the reason why we're seeing countries like Finland and Sweden applying for membership for NATO. So I think it has demonstrated all countries that there's no way that regional stability and order can be maintained without collective security. And secondly, Turkey's significant geostrategic place. And I think for Turkey, because this has created really a window of opportunity for Turkey's rapprochement with the West, with both Europe and the United States. And also Turkey has, especially over the years, has an increasing relationship with Russia as well. I think the European countries, as well as the United States, needs to take advantage of this window of opportunity, recognizing Turkey's interest in the region as well, so that a better relationship could be maintained between Europe and Turkey, which Turkey is also part of Europe. And I think another important thing which the crisis has also demonstrated, because one thing we know as the conflict goes on, I think the conflict started, I will agree actually with what has been discussed with Mr. Voloshin, deterrence has really failed in this context. So European countries have moved towards punishment. And it's always a better thing for deterrence to work, because most of the time the punishment unfortunately fails once the invasion begins. So I think better mechanisms for deterrence would be especially important to recognize in this conflict. And as the war continues, the unity that we see in Europe may also fade, which I think is a worrying thing as well, which goes back to the former question. It's not only like whether Turkey can sustain its balancing position, but even the unity we observe could dissolve, because the economic costs could also increase for European countries as well. So I think that really the lesson to get out of all of this is there is definitely a need, especially in the post-Cold War period. There has been this discussion of the liberal international order, and let's focus on how to maintain collective security. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, actually, I do think it has backfired for Russia, because it has demonstrated to countries why we need a stronger defense and security policy in Europe to be able to maintain order and stability in the region. And Turkey's crucial position, like it's impossible to ignore Turkey in the region if you're thinking about the future of peace in the region.
Thank you, Ms. Gilgal. Ambassador Rimon, we have some time left if you want to react to what has been said, and to maybe come back to my question about if the EU did enough since the 2013, 2014, and Crimea's annexation. Thank you.
has Europe done enough, first of all, to answer your question, Ines? To some extent, no, of course, because as we see, all our efforts have not prevented war from happening. And once again, I think we all have to admit it is a failure. It's not for not trying. The French president, many of his counterparts in Europe have tried to reach out to Russia and to start a dialogue and to find ways of closing the gap and bridging the gap with Russia. But it did not work, let's be honest, and we have to take that into account. So certainly we have to try again, but we can't try to do that while a conflict is happening on the European soil. We have to stop that conflict. And there I'm very sorry to come back again. But, you know, if you only look at this conflict, and I think we will all agree on this, there is an aggressor and there is a country that has aggressed and there is a country that has been aggressed. And that's the reality we have to take into account. And if you have decided to aggress, then you have to accept that at some point this will have some consequences for you. I'm not talking about humiliation or defeat or whatever. I'm talking about the fact that one has to recognize that this war is not acceptable and should never have started. And more than anything else, I think it is important that all sides recognize at some point that the integrity, the territorial integrity of Ukraine must be protected and safeguarded. I think that is very important. To allow the change of borders and the change of a nation's territory by force is something that is not accepted by UN Charter, by EU principles, by everything that was there in the European Security Order dating back to Helsinki, 1975. Even during the Cold War, this was understood. So just to try to come back on some of these essential principles of the everyday life in our foreign world, in the international scene, is something that I think cannot be accepted. So if we're looking from some peace settlement at the end of the day, these very simple principles will have to be, once again, reaffirmed and implemented, which means that Ukraine must regain its territorial integrity. For me, that's at the core of what must be discussed. Europe can try to play a role, but of course, from the Russian point of view, Europe is now a party to the conflict to some extent, even if we repeat that we are not. It is supporting Ukraine. So I think it is with nations like Turkey or maybe others, and maybe hopefully some other partners in the third partners, that we could hope to have more input in those efforts towards peace. I think any country that is part of the UN, the United Nations, should support Antonio Guterres' efforts at the moment. Otherwise, there's no point in being a member of the UN if you don't accept the responsibilities that go with this kind of membership. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. This is extremely interesting. We now have some time left for a short Q&A session addressed to all members of the panel. So first question to all of you. This Tuesday, during the Ukraine's related defense talks in Germany, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warned not to underestimate the elevated risks of nuclear war, and he said he viewed NATO as being, in a sense, engaged in a proxy war with Russia by supplying Kiev with weapons. How likely is the Russia-Ukrainian war to escalate into a broader war opposing the two main camps, NATO versus Russia? Is it already the case, according to you?
May I very briefly? I believe that distinguished participants do know this principle from the theory of international conflict management, is the domination and escalation. That's principle. So to decipher, it means that a stronger participant of the conflict will always have an opportunity to dominate with the stronger weapons if the other participant of the conflict is provided with the stronger weapons. So I mean, definitely the West will never provide Ukraine with nuclear weapons, hopefully, and still Russia does have it already. So it means that the very strategy of the West trying to send weapons to Ukraine to win over Russia strategically falls, because at the end of the day, we go up to the level when Russia can be forced to use weapons Ukraine will never be provided with. You understand what I mean? So from this standpoint, I don't like it as well, but it's a real world. And there is a world where there are nuclear great powers and there are smaller states. And a smaller state can never win war over nuclear power. We need just to admit it and do our best to prevent the conflict that will touch every one of us wherever we are. I mean, the nuclear war. That's what we should always consider. And it's about this meeting in Ramstein where there was, I believe, I will be very straightforward, very stupid idea that the West needs to ensure Ukrainian military wins, not just creates a balance. That's a difference. Creates a balance, it's achievable. But wins, I mean, taking back Donbass, Crimea by force, at the end of the day, we will definitely have a nuclear war.
Thank you, Mr. Voloshin. Ms. Gilgal or Ambassador Vimon, what are your thoughts?
I would like to state that, I mean, nuclear war, as we all know, is a war that no one wins. And we always say with nuclear war, like even if the percentage of a nuclear war is 0.001%, that is still a high percent. And I think it's important always with at times, because Russia has been, both Putin and Lavrov have been at times pointed to the fact of nuclear weapons Russia possesses. So I think it's important always to keep in mind, even if the percentage is 0.001%, to keep that in mind. And I think it also brings us to the point of why de-escalation is crucial at this point. Because even if the percentage is minor, there's always that risk. Even though obviously we hope that it would never ever turn into a situation where nuclear weapons are used. But I think the fact that Russia at times is reminding the involving actors of the fact of nuclear weapons is still an important, serious thing to take into account when one is thinking about the options of how to deal with the situation. So I think it just points to the fact that de-escalation and achieving a ceasefire and end of the war is why so crucial at this point.
A very quick word, because I totally agree, and I think we're all looking for de-escalation. But the point I would make with regard to this nuclear threat is that at the moment, on the other side, among European countries, just as with the United States, you also have nuclear powers there. And deterrence is precisely about that. It's about nuclear powers facing each other and being smart enough to understand that nobody can win a nuclear war. So this threat of escalation will go nowhere, and we all know that. Coming back to the whole point I'm trying to make, it's a very simple one. And once again, I think we should all be aware of that, is that this war happened because one country, namely Russia, decided to move into that war. And you can't expect from a country like Ukraine to stay put and to accept to be invaded and overwhelmed. And not to fight for its territorial integrity and its sovereignty. and you cannot expect allies of Ukraine to stay put and not try to help them in defending themselves. So that's the reality. And once you have accepted that, if everybody is responsible enough, they should start getting back around the table. Russia and Ukraine did it a month ago, precisely thanks to the Turkish mediation. And they started to discuss about interesting things. Neutrality of Ukraine, non-membership of NATO. And that has gone nowhere for the time being. So I'm hoping that at some stage, these discussion will be resumed. And the sooner the better, once again, in my opinion.
Thank you, Ambassador. To react to what you just said, I have a question for all of the panel. Is the option of Ukraine joining the EU a realistic one? And could this be an alternative to joining the Atlantic Alliance, according to you?
If I may again first, as for you, it's up to you. Actually, I don't think it's a realistic option. And there will be lots of explanation on the part of EU, and European bureaucrats are very talented finding them. They can always say that there is Western Balkans in the line, and Turkey, after all, in the line, and others and others. But as for the NATO, again, I agree with the principles, definitely, as a diplomat, first and foremost, and definitely as Ukrainian as well. Definitely, I fully agree, 100% agree with the principles that Mr. Rimon stipulates here, because it's a basic principles we all need to stick to. I'm just speaking about the realistic options. And for me, so I believe it would have been very reasonable shooting Rammstein in line with the plea to support Ukraine militarily and otherwise. They would have sounded some offer to Russia, meaning like members of NATO declare that they are ready to negotiate with Russia a treaty on neutrality of Ukraine, like we have with regard to Austria. But such an offer never was pronounced. So again, the West, for the moment, and it's a very, very discouraging development, pretends it doesn't seek as a solution to the conflict, but the victory of Ukraine, military victory over Russia, and it's unachievable. That's just reality of the day.
Then, if we go along with what you're saying, Mr. Voloshin, that means that might beats right, and that the use of force...
that has always been the ambassador, frankly, in history of the world.
It's the reality of the day, but at some stage, if you want to have some stability on the European continent, and even I would say some stability in the international order, you have to push back against that, because otherwise we're moving into perpetual conflicts all over the world, and we have to be very careful for that. You rightly say that diplomats must be maybe optimistic and try to prevail at the end of the day. But if you start by admitting that force will prevail in the end, let's stop there. There's no use in trying to discuss. And could I add another point? Before this war started, after a long pressure from Russia, we were starting to propose a new round of arms control related to strategic nuclear weapons, related to conventional forces in Europe, all things that Russia was asking for. And the answer to this proposition was February 24th and the start of this unacceptable conflict. So to say that the Western side hasn't been forthcoming with some diplomatic proposition is not right. We were there ready to discuss all of this. And the whole unfolding of events since then has not been what we were asking for.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I see that Mr. Jurash has joined us. So welcome, Mr. Jurash. Thank you for making the time to be with us. I have a question for you, if you are here. I don't
Yes.
see the question I just asked the panel that I will repeat is the option of Ukraine joining the EU a realistic one? And is the Finnish or Austrian model belonging to the EU and not to NATO a viable model for Ukraine to follow, according to you?
It's in our constitution, the fact that Ukraine should pursue EU and NATO. And believe me, with the conflict raging in part of Ukraine right now, the support for joining Western institutions has never been higher. We are in no mood, in no situation that we can accept compromise on our sovereignty with Russia. Russia doesn't have a say on our future. And as we lose thousands every single day around my country, we do not want that sacrifice to go to waste. Of course, it's the EU's and NATO call whether to let us in. But let me just say it's very clear that right now in Ukraine, what we have is draining of Russian forces as in no time in our history. So reality is that Russia is being made impotent by all the fighting here in Ukraine and all the victories we have day in, day out. And as we pushed Russians out of Kiev, out of Sumy, out of Chernigiv, and we'll continue pushing them in other areas, we will show the West the fact that we are the West, even though we are not a part of those institutions. But again, we by no means, the parliament, I can guarantee you that much, will never vote for the taking out of our constitution EU and NATO exactly because Russia wants that to happen. If this was internal dialogue about the future of Ukraine and viability of NATO and whether EU is perfect and all that, we can discuss these matters. But exactly because Russia demands it, our parliament will never vote to strike out of our constitution, joining NATO. And as far as the EU is concerned, I'm very, very pleased by all the steps that we've been making in membership, in becoming members of the EU, and steps in that direction, of course, are basically what we fought for since the Euromaidan Revolution 2014, and basically Ukrainians have been dying for the chance to become a part of European and Western community. So the point here is that for us to forsake that because Russia wants it is as unacceptable as it comes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jurash. And I have another question for you. Do you see any possible prospects for reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia in the future?
If Germany has an embassy in Israel, then there is a point in which we can reconcile. But that point is not now and not in any time in a viable future. And with Mr. Putin in charge especially, we see how negotiations right now between Russia and Ukraine are not coming to fruition because Russia wants us to essentially forego our integrity, sovereignty, and independence and become basically a chewed up version of a nation state. That we shall not do, and that is what we are fighting against every single day in our country. So the point here is that that reconciliation is something that at one point or another, as history tells us, happens between even the wildest of rivals. But the reality is that that is not something that can be easily discussed in Ukraine right now, because again, people are losing their loved ones, their dear ones every single day around my country. And for that reason, for them even to speak of this is unacceptable. I can tell you that because of the listening to Echo Moscow, the opposition well, it's now seen as the opposition radio station in Russia, and listening to all the voices that hated Mr. Putin for the last 15 years in Russia itself, I do understand that there are plenty of Russians who would not agree with what Mr. Putin is doing, has done, and will be doing throughout his rule of Russia. But still, those voices are impotent enough to be relevant in Russia itself. But as far as the future is concerned, that's exactly why I basically one day before the start of the conflict had joined a public live conversation with Navalny's team in Russia. And basically a few days into the conflict, I spoke with them again, speaking exactly about this matter, because I am a believer that those voices which I listened to for all these years in Echo of Moscow, those voices that hated Putin and hated his policies all around the world, will prevail eventually, and we'll need to have an open window with them, one sort or the other, to search for the possibility of amends for the horrors that Russia is doing here right now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jurash, for your insight. Ms. Gilgal or Ambassador Vimont, do you want a last word, react what has been said before we conclude?
No, I think, you know, in this terrible conflict we're facing at the moment, the last word must always be to Ukraine. And therefore, we need to be very humbled when we see the catastrophe, the tragedy that is going on, the horrendous number of casualties among the civilian population. We have to pay tribute to Ukraine and listen to what the Ukrainian people, their members of parliament and others are saying. I think that's the most important. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you and for this lively discussion today and for your precious contribution to the topic. I will now give the floor to Mr. Malos for some concluding remarks, and we will then end the discussion for today. Thank you again.
Mr. Malos, I don't believe that you turned the microphone on.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. I forgot that. So no, I would just thank very much Mr. Joas to be present and to speak, and we just express on my behalf and on Vocal Europe behalf and of all behalf all sympathy and compassion and support for Ukraine. As Pierre Vimont said, he knows that our heart is with you. You know, but personally, I was on Maidan. I was one of the first French person to be put on the blacklist by Russia already in 2015, and always fighting for the sovereignty of Ukraine and for of course the development of Ukraine and for the I would say a stronger relation between Ukraine and the European Union. I think I was with some friends who were among the first to pledge 2 months ago for an accelerated enlargement of EU to Ukraine. And I think this will be possible, and you know that you will have allies and support. I will just come back to say now that we try, despite the tragedy, to find ways, and I think to get out of that war and of that aggression. I'm very thankful also to Ambassador Pierre Vimont, to Mrs. Gilgal from Turkey, so to give us some ideas, and even also from Mr. Voloshin to give his testimony. I think, of course, for all of us, as soon as possible to end that war, the better it will end the suffering of the Ukrainian nation, of Ukrainian people, and we know how tragic is the situation for people there. We know also that as soon as it's ended, so much better it will help for the peace and to avoid the Third World War and to avoid all the consequences for Europe and for the planet of that tragedy. So that, of course, should be the priority. That's why we say today that, as Pierre Vimont mentioned, we should support what the UN is doing. We know that today, Secretary General of UN, Mr. Guterres, is in Kiev, and for humanitarian corridors, for humanitarian aid, but also for seeking for peace resolution. This is very important, as the role of countries like Turkey and others who could help to mediator. It's important to preserve their role as a mediator. But I will add as last point, as Pierre Vimont mentioned in his first intervention, there is clearly a Russian problem. And we should not get out of that. There's a Russian problem, not just for, I would say, for the European Union, for the European continent, of course, first of all, for Ukraine. But there is a global Russian problem for the peace and for the planet, and we have to deal with that. Past is the past. I totally agree with what was said, that probably we missed opportunities after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain to have reconciliation. We know as French what was the reconciliation between French and German. All the time it took, and all the necessary, among not just the diplomats, act a lot, but also civil society, ordinary citizens, and this reconciliation has not been made between Baltic states and Russia, between, and of course, it's not just our responsibility, the responsibility mainly of Russia. So there have been some attempts, some start in the 90s. You remember Katyn recognition of the Katyn massacre and some others in the early 90s, but this has unfortunately stopped. But I think the resolution of a conflict is, of course, ceasefire, of course, preserving peace, preserving the sovereignty of Ukraine, but also, I think, to get a broader look and to find of a new way to create reconciliation, to create peace and stability, as we say, settlement, which this time will involve Russia and will try to solve that Russian problem, who cannot be, as we say, the threat that we have under our heads about a possible horrible conflict. And I will just ask to Mr. Juraj if you want to say a last word, because he joined us later, because he's Ukrainian fighter for Ukraine sovereignty. So if you want to say a last word, I give him with pleasure the last word. Mr. Juraj, please.
Well, I just want to say that I met you back in 2014 during the Euromaidan revolution. I actually sent a photo I found of us meeting. During the Maidan, I was heading the National Center of the Maidan, and I had the pleasure of meeting you back then. So I thank you for your position on supporting our European ambitions. And I mean, they are ambitions to do with the fact that Ukraine doesn't have a geographic choice here. So the East or the West, and the East is trying to destroy us. As you see every single day on your TVs that tell you what the horrific facts happening here. But the West is, as imperfect as it is, it's still that home which we historically had always tried to pursue. And with allies like yourself, we can try and imagine that as something that can be achieved. So I thank you for your work. I thank you for your words. And if we work together, I think we can achieve a more prosperous, more secure Europe.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a beautiful day.